And welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio, broadcasting here on the Big Talker 1067 FM and Sauga 960 AM. We told you before that we'd have a treat, and indeed we do. We're speaking with Rachel Chiu. She was a Young Voices contributor. She writes about technology and employment policy. She's been published in the USA Today, the American Conservative, and elsewhere. She works at a DC-based think tank. You can follow her thoughts on Twitter at Rachel H. Chiu, Chiu. Rachel, thanks so much for coming on Consumer Choice Radio.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
So the reason we want to have you on is there's a lot that's happening with regards to so-mentioned big tech. And the one article that we had passed along was from Tech Dirt. It's actually one of my favorite blogs that I've been reading for a long time. And your article is Misguided Crusade for Tech Antitrust Will Exacerbate Inequality. And you have a lot of different points that you mentioned in here, but just kind of give us, if you could, for the listeners, a kind of broken down version of your argument and why you think any of this type of antitrust action in Washington, D.C. will exacerbate inequality.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much. So just to provide some background information, over the past few months, we've seen this growing fight against big tech in Congress. And it's surprisingly something that both sides of the aisle can agree upon. So Democrats believe that these big tech companies are too powerful, whereas Republicans have this ongoing gripe against the companies for perceived conservative censorship. And antitrust is a tool that they both seem to gravitate towards. And while bipartisanship is usually a welcome departure from what we usually have, in this case, it's only created this anti-tech echo chamber where they see bigness is perceived as badness. And we see this type of discussion rather than a thoughtful discourse of whether or not there is anti-competitive behavior, which I would say no. And more importantly, whether the effects of antitrust enforcement in these instances would be beneficial. And I would say and argue that it would cause more harm rather than preventing consumer harm.
And so on the conservative side, I would love it if you could weigh in on perceived biases, because that seems to be something that dominates the center right ecosystem. Is that Facebook and Twitter are biased against conservatives, and they censor conservatives more than they do their liberal or progressive counterparts. Is there any weight to that claim? Or is that just perception?
So I would say that these tech companies are not perfect. And the way that they go about running their websites is not always ideal. And mistakes are going to be made, especially when they're so large. But mistaking that for a reason to break them up, to change their business model, to erode the consumer experience is not the way to go. And I think we see what you mentioned and what I did as well about conservative bias, along with the fact that they're too big. They're reasons to not like tech companies, but are they necessarily reasons to engage in antitrust enforcement? And that question, I think, is a little bit more murky.
Definitely. And one point that I thought was very interesting, and I think it relates to the inequality, and it's something that we don't necessarily think about often in these domestic policy debates over tech companies, is that most of these companies have international reach. They have an international client base. And one point that you mentioned in the article is that many of these restrictions, if they were to be enforced, would actually harm human rights. Specifically those of human rights advocates and victims of totalitarian regimes. You mentioned the example of WhatsApp, the encrypted messaging app, and that if for some reason the government would force Facebook to spin this off and sell it because it's not necessarily a hugely, we'll say, lucrative product, that might be shut down, or who knows what might happen to that. And that therefore the people that rely on this app to communicate and to do so without, the censors, they would actually be put in harm's way. Are there other examples or perhaps things that we're not even thinking of when it comes to human rights that could also be impacted by any of these very crazy types of antitrust actions?
Yeah, of course. And I think that's the scary thing about all of this, that we talk about how big tech has all these issues, but then when these proposals are given, they don't really talk about what the impact is going to be. So like you mentioned, WhatsApp is one example of this. Regulators have already targeted Facebook for its recent mergers, and they're attempting to unwind that. One being Instagram, one being WhatsApp. And for that one specifically, I foresee two issues. Because WhatsApp is not monetized, there's going to have to be a drastic change to the business model in order to support the application if it cannot benefit from Facebook's bigness. So one option I see is that it could be a subscriber model, which would mean that it's less accessible, or they would have to introduce ads, which would pose security issues for those who really need it most. And like I said, I think that there's such an inherent risk when we talk about how big tech needs to be taken down, but we haven't really looked at the impact in its widest scope, and people who we may not even think may be caught up in all of this can really be harmed.
And I'll do one follow up on that. One portion again that you mentioned in the article and that is often overlooked is that we're talking about the bigness of these companies, but oftentimes it seems that the rules that are being proposed or a lot of the actions by some of these enforcement agencies would actually serve to restrict the entire marketplace altogether. So then the question becomes, if they were to do this, could you even have a competitor to a Facebook or a Google or any of these other companies if it is then so restricted? And then essentially, what would that mean for consumers in that case?
That's exactly right. So we're seeing that it's almost bad if you get too big. So it's almost like if you are too successful, then that's perceived as unfairly participating in the marketplace. But I think something that's important to think about when we talk about all of this is that market dominance, monopoly power, those in and of itself are not illegal. And there's nothing wrong with that. And in the context of antitrust, the reason why the consumer welfare standard is so important, even though it has been under fire in the last few years, is because it shifts the focus to how does all of this affect consumers? And I think it's without a doubt the largest population in all of this is consumers. We are all consumers, but we're seeing that there's this shift to say, okay, how are individual competitors being affected? And in that case, the government starts to pick winners and losers, and that should be a frightening thing.
In that sense of competition and monopoly power, I mean, Yael and I in the past have chatted about the headlines about MySpace back in the day, that MySpace was just too powerful, and the headlines at the time that MySpace needed to be broken up. Do you think that examples like MySpace should cause maybe some sense of caution for legislators, where what is perceived today may not always hold true for the future?
I think that's exactly right. Right now, what we're seeing with big tech, that's just what is socially and politically expedient, because there's this growing, as we said, disdain for big tech. But what we're seeing with all of this is this more for helping consumers, for improving the marketplace, or is it just an opportunity for congressmen to get that soundbite for their re-election campaigns? And that, I think, is something that we need to discuss a little bit more, because if they go and they engage in overhauling antitrust and creating more opportunities for antitrust regulation where perhaps it's not necessary, those are going to have long-term effects. And it's really going to impact consumers in the long run.
And I think it's made all the more dangerous, obviously, because this is not a one party affair. It seems as if there is a lot of bipartisanship on this. Is that something that you think will continue? Do you think there'll be a rift? Or do you think perhaps there will be a kind of, forgive the pun, but a come to Jesus moment where people will understand more about the innovative nature of these companies rather than, this strange caricature of a, huge vacuum cleaner of all of our data or something like this?
Yeah. So Democrats believe that these big tech companies are too powerful. Republicans have the bias concerns. So we see that on the front end, that there's this disdain for big tech, not so much consensus on what should be done, just that they want something done and they want to show that they took on these big tech companies. But at the end of the day, what we're going to see, I believe, is some great action in terms of a spectacle, like breaking up big tech, right? And all of the smaller options that they proposed, like data portability, it's just not going to be enough to satisfy their bases. So something big, I think both of them may be able to agree on, but it's not going to be for the reasons, or it's not going to accomplish all the things that they said throughout the way.
You're listening to Consumer Choice Radio. We're speaking with Rachel Chiu. We had an article that we just mentioned there about everything with big tech. And you know what, David? She's not just an expert on this, but she can also discuss one of the topics that we've covered a lot on this program and that we think is very important, and that is the Chinese Communist Party. And Rachel, I refer to your article in USA Today from last month. My grandmother stood up to the Chinese Communist Party. President Joe Biden should too. I think there's a very powerful piece. We'll definitely put that in the show notes so others can read. What does Joe Biden not know, or what do the American people not necessarily know about the Chinese Communist Party, its history, and perhaps its aims? Because that's something that I think a lot of people don't really know about nor follow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in my USA Today piece, I talked about my grandmother's story. This is back in the 1950s when the communist regime was just coming to power. And because she had married into the landlord class, she was seen as a threat because property owners wouldn't bode well in their new economic restructuring and the society that they were trying to build. So because she was seen as a threat, they robbed her, beat her, enslaved her for many years, and she was able to escape, thankfully. But that regime is still in power. The CCP is still in place using those same tactics of violence and arrest. We see that with the Uyghurs and the Hong Kongers. And just it's so unfortunate to see that even though they've gained the economic prosperity, should we say, over the past few years and decades, they still don't have that social control that they really want. And that they've never been able to achieve. And I think that's important in this discussion when we talk about the CCP and its threat and what they stand for and what have we seen over the past few years. So I would encourage, and this is the point that I had in that article, that the Biden administration should really think about that the CCP has never been able to silence their political opponents. And that for one reason that I gave is that can serve as an important motivator to provide asylum and refugee status to the people that the CCP perceives as a threat, people like my grandmother.
Yeah, and the asylum question is an important one because I know that the UK, in response to Hong Kong, had opened up a meaningful pathway to citizenship. I think it would be great if both Canada and the United States could follow suit. So I'm just curious as to whether or not you think that that's part of a viable solution for what has gone on in Hong Kong in terms of the possibility of Biden taking a second look at asylum or refugee status for some of these people.
Definitely. So with the case, and I'm glad you brought it up with the UK, the UK and Hong Kong are tied historically for a whole host of reasons, but they have great interest in Hong Kong from a social standpoint, from an economic standpoint. But I would argue that the US and many other countries also do. So in the context of the US, we have millions of Americans who live in Hong Kong. We have financial interests as well. But then I also think that there's this human element of the American values that we have for freedom, liberty, all of those things. That's what the people in Hong Kong believe as well. And that's what they're fighting for right now. And that should really resonate with the people in America and other free societies.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We've been speaking with Rachel Chiu. You can read more of her work. We'll link to that in our show notes. You can follow her on Twitter at Rachel HCHIU. Rachel, thanks so much for coming on Consumer Choice Radio.
Thanks for having me.